Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. The Reserve Bank of India's newly appointed Governor Sanjay Malhotra took charge today as the 26th Governor of the Central Bank for the next 3 years. In fact, he was just holding a press conference just a short while back, wherein, he stated that the bank, needs to use technology. We're in a completely different world. He also, stated that RBI is now in its 90th year, and of course, it has given the theme of trust, stability, and growth. Those were some of the key points that were made. In fact, the newly appointed governor also spoke about the need for RBI to make financial inclusion even more pervasive. In fact, he has a whole host of challenges right ahead of him. That is to support GDP growth, which has seen a bit of a blip in Q2, stabilize the rupee against strengthening dollar, and of course, framing policies to counter global headwinds and provide relief to home buyers. Of course, to discuss that and more, and to understand more about what lies ahead of the governor in terms of his tenure, I'm now joined by Madan, who's the chief economist at Bank of Baroda. Thank you very much, Mr. Sabanvis, for joining us here on ET. Now, first things first, give us a sense of what you make of the speech of the newly appointed governor.
I think the governor has been very cautious and non-committal on the first day. So that's what he has said up front, that he would need to be here for a few more days, and then he would get back on more concrete thoughts. So what he's actually spoken about: technology, spoken about financial inclusion. These are the goals of the government of India as well as Reserve Bank of India. We've seen a lot of progress being done there in the financial sector on financial inclusion. Also, the kind of advance which we have made in technology, I think that's very well known. So this is the non-committal part of it. But I think we would get to know in course of time, hopefully in the next week or so, as to what exactly the governor feels about how we should be addressing the different challenges which we have today. I think chief among them are, of course, something like the monetary policy. But we should keep one thing in mind, that the monetary policy committee consists of only half the members being from Reserve Bank. We have 3 outside experts also. But to the extent that one gets to know about how the governor would tend to vote when we have the next policy in February, I think that could probably talk about what kind of inclinations he does have, but that would only be by implication. The other thing, of course, is in terms of the immediate problem which we're having of the rupee depreciating. I think that's something which the market would be interested to see as to whether the governor would like to defend the rupee to the same extent, or whether he'll wait and watch. Yeah.
Right. Absolutely, absolutely, sir. And let me also bring in Mr. Suvodeep Rakshit. He's, of course, the chief economist at Kotak Institutional Equities. Thanks very much, Mr. Rakshit, for taking the time out. Of course, Mr. Sabanvis stating that, the new RBI governor, in his very first speech as RBI governor, maintained a very cautious approach. It was a non-committal approach. And, of course, hinting at perhaps, he was expecting more. What's your overall take? Were you expecting more from him on some of the key issues that really faces tenure?
I think importantly, he came across as the governor of the RBI in the capacity not just in terms of looking at the monetary policy or the banking sector, etc., which a lot of people in the market would be looking for, but also the wider role of the RBI, which has to do not just with the banking system per se or the monetary policy per se, but also in terms of the financial inclusion, in terms of the broader area of the financial services, and what it means for the nation, and how it aligns with the goals of the country in some sense, of the government in some sense. And I think that is kind of a first step that he wanted to take. And it has come off well in the sense that it paints a broad picture in terms of where the RBI is and what all he wants to touch upon. Obviously, the specifics in terms of monetary policy, in terms of banking regulations, in terms of liquidity, etc., which we in the market would want to hear, that obviously will come eventually, because there are a certain, I'm sure there are protocols that would need to be looked into. It's also the silent period, by the way, post policy. So I'm not sure if as a governor, he can make comments on those. And possibly after the minutes are made public, we will start hearing a bit more in terms of what what we want to hear from in the markets in terms of the monetary policy, liquidity, etc.
Right, Mr. Rakshit, and let me come to you, Mr. Sabanvis. Would you be able to help us understand what his approach is going to be on so far as managing inflation is concerned? And do you anticipate a Feb rate cut on the card, seeing the kind of inflation we've seen, the trajectory that we've seen of inflation, and of course those muted GDP numbers in the past quarter?
See, a lot will actually depend upon how the inflation numbers turn out to be when the MPC meets in the month of February. So we had numbers of 6.2 and 5.5%. These were the last two numbers when the MPC met in the month of December. Now, to my mind, I think the inflation numbers for November and December would tend to be in the 5+ range, which means that the MPC will again be looking at numbers of around 5%. But I think the RBI would also be looking, rather the MPC would also be looking at the future trajectory of inflation. So there's a good possibility that on account of the good Kharif harvest, which is what we are expecting, there would be certain cooling of prices. Food inflation in particular would be trending downwards. And it's quite possible that the MPC may feel that even though inflation currently is running at about 5%, there's a very good chance of inflation going below that 5% number, closer towards 4.5% in the coming months on account of good food inflation and relatively stable core inflation. I think there's a good chance of a rate cut being invoked. And I think the reason I get that this could be happening is that if you look at the independent committee members, in October, there was just one member who voted for a rate cut. In December, there were two members who voted for a rate cut. And it's quite possible that the majority could be moving towards a rate cut. Of course, it would also depend upon how the RBI internal members do look at it. This is where I think the governor will be casting a very important vote, because we'll get to know what his inclinations are. It would be a new deputy governor too on the committee. We'd like to know what his views are. But I look on balance, I think it may just about be the earliest. I mean, it could be time to cut the rate. But even if they don't, I think there would be a strong explanation for that too, because we're not quite sure how the global scenario is evolving. So even if it happens in April, that also won't be a surprise. But if I have to commit to something, I think yes, in February there would be a rate cut.
All right, so the anticipation is, Mr. Sabanvis, that there would be a rate cut, but very important point that you mentioned about the global headwinds, of course, global factors as well. And let me come to you, Mr. Rakshit, on that point. There are, challenges of not just a slowing growth in the country, but the big challenge is also to stabilize the rupee against a strengthening dollar, which is only going to strengthen further given the anticipation around Trump 2.0 and his policies amidst global headwinds. Where do you weigh in on that?
Well, clearly, I think the global challenges arising from US's economic policies will be a headwind for most part of, I think, at least the first half of CY25, if not longer. But having said that, we already have seen a USD strengthening come in since Trump was elected. And following that, there are other headwinds that we will encounter when actually the Trump presidency starts off. Now, the reaction from a central bank cannot be a single strategy in such a case. In fact, if we kind of go back to the theoretical aspects and to some extent the practical aspects of monetary policy, you cannot control everything with one instrument, which in this case, let's say, is the interest rate. So there will be a multi-pronged strategy, which already we have seen start to play out in terms of using the FX reserves, the forwards, and the interest rates, the liquidity situation. Now we will see how the new governor thinks about it, how the RBI thinks about it, with declining inflation prints, which is expected over the next couple of months, the kind of growth impetus that we see, and what kind of global policies and the kind of strengthening in the US dollar, etc., that we kind of see. All in all, we have to take all of these elements into account before we kind of talk about what the eventual policy decision or what kind of strategies will evolve.
Right. Right, Mr. Sabanvis, let me come to you on that. Of course, the one major challenge ahead of the governor is to, of course, help in reversing the slow GDP that we've seen in the past quarter. Do you anticipate any change in government's policy on that front? How is government going to look at that? Because, as of now, from the North Bloc, we've only seen a bullishness being expressed so far as India's GDP growth is concerned. In fact, North Bloc officials stating that this is just a blip and we should not read too much into it.
No, in fact, we would also tend to agree with that particular view, because even when we had the Q2 GDP numbers come out, our models showed that India's growth would be 6.6 to 6.8% for the year. So that's where our stance hasn't really changed out there. RBI has come out with 6.6%. And even if you look at the internals of GDP growth, we have seen the service sector doing very well. We have seen agriculture doing very well. We have seen construction do rather well over a high base. So it's only been the manufacturing sector. And I think we're quite aware of the fact that when manufacturing sector hasn't really done well, it's primarily been account of demand conditions. Now, demand conditions are not something which can be reversed by interest rates. It cannot be reversed by government policy. They can actually aid at the margin to make sure that things are more comfortable. But at the end of the day, I think we need to be creating more jobs. We need to be generating more income. And I think a lot of effort has been on, from the point of view of the government, to have all these schemes which are announced in the budget to try and push both employment in the private sector. But it's a slow evolving process. So I think the Indian growth story remains fairly intact, and we are sanguine that in the second half of the year, we could be looking at growth in the region of about 7%, which really means that when the MPC is going to take a decision, it will not be a case of saying, look, growth is faltering, inflation seems to be under control, let's cut interest rates. We will be having growth which is fairly stable and steady in this region of around 7%. And it's only a case of saying that, is it the right time to reduce the interest rates because of inflationary conditions? Because the MPC is supposed to target inflation. That is the official mandate. That's a legislative mandate. So on those grounds, there could be a case for lowering the interest rates. I don't think lower interest rates will be a kind of a solution for the perceived growth rate, which I think is good. But okay, there could be certain sections thinking that growth has slowed down. That would not be the main objective, is what I feel.
Right. Right, Mr. Sabanvis. Thank you very much, Mr. Sabanvis and Mr. Suvodeep Rakshit, for joining us here on ET Now. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the big task ahead of the RBI Governor. That is to bring retail inflation below the 6% target, support GDP growth, and at the same time stabilize a strengthening dollar, stabilize rupee against a strengthening dollar, and of course frame policies to counter global headwinds. How does he really come up with those policies will be something that will be interesting to watch out for. And of course, in the coming few days, we'll hear more from the governor. On that note, thanks very much for staying tuned to this broadcast.
If you like this video, then like, share and subscribe to ET Now.